You know, this is a story about two nations, India and Pakistan. They were born from the very same land, from the same shared history. But for the last 77 years, their story hasn't been about what they share. It's been defined by the violence of their separation, by a single line drawn on a map that became a permanent scar on the heart of a subcontinent.
So you have to ask yourself, how did it all go so wrong? How did neighbors who had lived alongside each other for centuries end up turning on one another with such unbelievable fury? Well, to really get a handle on the conflict that defines them today, we have to go back, way back, to the very first crack in their foundation.
To get to the bottom of this, we're going to look at 4 critical moments. We'll start with the first deliberate split under British rule. Then we'll witness the absolute cataclysm of 1947. And from there, we'll trace the wars that kept erupting. The thing to remember is, none of these are isolated events. They're all links in a chain of conflict, a chain that still binds these two nations today. All right, so to really understand this, we have to rewind. We're not starting in 1947, no. We have to go back decades earlier, to a time when the very idea of a single independent India was just starting to take shape. But even back then, there were powerful forces at play, working to make sure that a united front would be, well, basically impossible.
See, the British Empire was getting nervous. They saw this rising tide of nationalism, this powerful mix of Hindu and Muslim voices all demanding one thing, freedom. And the heart of this movement? It was in Bengal. So, to break this unity, the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, came up with a plan in 1905. The official reason he gave was administrative efficiency, but the real reason was much simpler: divide and rule. He split Bengal into a Hindu-majority west and a new Muslim-majority east, hoping they'd get busy fighting each other instead of fighting the crown. It was the first major wedge.
And just 4 years later, the British doubled down. They took this division off the map and wrote it directly into the law. They created something called separate electorates. It meant that in certain places, Muslims could only vote for Muslim candidates and Hindus could only vote for Hindu candidates. It might sound like a small bureaucratic change, but it was absolutely revolutionary. For the first time ever, a person's religion legally defined their political identity. And that put India on a path it could never turn back from.
Now, the stated goal, the official line, was that this policy was to protect minority rights, to make sure Muslims had a voice in politics. But the long-term consequence was so much deeper. It essentially taught an entire generation of people to see themselves not as Indians who happen to be Muslim or Hindu, but as Muslims and Hindus who just happen to live in India. It created 2 separate political tracks that were, tragically, headed for 2 very different destinations.
And the ultimate tragedy of this whole division, it's really personified by one man, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, you might know him as the founder of Pakistan, but he started his career as a die-hard secularist in the Indian National Congress. He fought so passionately for a united India that he was once famously called the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. But over the years, he started to believe that in a united India, with its Hindu majority, Muslims would always be sidelined. Understanding his journey from a champion of unity to the architect of partition is really the key to understanding this entire story.
So, once those seeds of division were planted, well, they grew. And they grew fast. The entire political landscape started to shift. The main fight wasn't just against the British anymore. Now it was between the 2 major Indian parties, the Indian National Congress, which wanted a single, unified India, and Jinnah's All India Muslim League, which was starting to believe that separation was the only way forward.
And then came the 1946 election. This was it. This was basically a referendum on the future of India. Jinnah's Muslim League ran on a single powerful idea: the creation of a separate state called Pakistan. The results were a political earthquake. The League won over 90% of the seats that were reserved for Muslims. Jinnah now had an undeniable mandate. This wasn't just a theory anymore. He had the votes to prove that he was the voice of India's Muslims, and that voice was demanding a brand new nation.
But even then, there was one last desperate attempt to hold things together. The British sent what was called the Cabinet Mission. They came with this super complex plan for a united India, but with a really weak central government. The Muslim League actually accepted it. They saw a path to a future Pakistan within it. But the Congress Party rejected it. They were afraid it would just lead to a weak, fractured India. And with that rejection, the very last hope for unity died.
Frustrated and out of political options, Jinnah called for a direct action day to show the world how much support there was for Pakistan. It was meant to be a peaceful protest, but in a city like Calcutta, which was already a powder keg of tension, it was like lighting a match. The city just erupted in communal violence. For 3 days, it burned. Hindus and Muslims who had been neighbors for generations started slaughtering each other in the streets. In just the first 72 hours, over 4,000 people were killed. The political debate was over. Now the argument was being settled with knives and fire, and suddenly partition didn't seem like a choice anymore. It seemed like the only way to escape an all-out civil war.
The horror of what happened in Calcutta, it was just a preview of what was about to unfold across the entire subcontinent. The British were desperate to leave, the Indian leaders couldn't agree, and partition was now seen as the only answer to stop the bleeding. It is almost impossible to wrap your head around the sheer scale of what happened next. In just a few weeks, something like 15 million people were uprooted. They were told that their ancestral homes, the places their families had lived for centuries, were no longer theirs. Muslims fled toward the new borders of Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs fled towards India. It was one of the largest, fastest, and most traumatic mass migrations in all of human history.
And this wasn't an orderly move. It was chaos. It was horror. Refugee trains were ambushed and everyone on board was massacred. People walking in long convoys were attacked. The violence was unimaginable. To this day, nobody knows the exact number, but the estimates are just staggering. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million people were killed in that frenzy of violence.
And the person responsible for drawing the border that sparked all this bloodshed? A British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe. And get this, he had never even set foot in India before. He was given a few weeks, some outdated maps, and flawed data, and with that, he drew a line that sealed the fate of millions. The Radcliffe line literally cut through villages, sliced farms in half, and sometimes even ran right through the middle of a house. It was a chaotic, arbitrary division that guaranteed conflict for decades to come.
So, as these two new nations are being born in blood and fire, the seeds of their next conflict are already being planted. And the problem was the so-called princely states, especially the beautiful and strategically vital region of Jammu and Kashmir.
Okay, so the situation in Kashmir was a tinderbox. You had a Hindu ruler, the Maharaja, in charge of a population that was overwhelmingly Muslim. He was kind of dreaming of being independent, of not joining either country. But Pakistan, seeing a Muslim-majority state, decided to force his hand. They backed an invasion of Pashtun tribesmen. As these fighters got close to the capital, the Maharaja panicked. He turned to India for help, and India's price for military support was simple. Kashmir had to join India. He signed the paper, Indian troops were immediately airlifted into Srinagar, and boom, the first India-Pakistan war began.
The war didn't really end with a clear winner. It was more of a stalemate. Eventually, the United Nations stepped in and brokered a ceasefire. And the line where the two armies stopped fighting, that became the new de facto border. At first, it was called the ceasefire line, but later it was renamed the line of control. And here's the kicker. It was supposed to be temporary. But today, over 75 years later, it's one of the most heavily militarized and dangerous borders on the planet.
And that first war over Kashmir, it wasn't a one-off event. It set this awful, devastating precedent. That temporary line became a permanent source of tension. And it kicked off this cycle of war, followed by a shaky, fragile peace, and then more hostility. It's a pattern that has defined their relationship ever since.
And you just see this pattern play out again and again. In 1965, Pakistan tried again to take Kashmir by force, sending in soldiers dressed as locals to start an uprising. That war also ended in a stalemate. Then in 1971, the fight shifted east. Pakistan was split into two parts, west and east, with 1,000 miles of India in between. When the West Pakistani army launched a brutal crackdown on the Bengali people in the east, millions of refugees poured into India. India intervened, and its military won a quick, decisive victory that led to the creation of a whole new country, Bangladesh. But then, decades later, in 1999, the conflict was right back in the mountains of Kashmir, with Pakistani soldiers seizing strategic peaks in the Kargil region, leading to another brutal, high-altitude war.
But right before that Kargil war, something happened that changed the game forever. In 1998, India tested nuclear weapons. Pakistan responded by testing its own just a few weeks later. And all of a sudden, this wasn't just a regional squabble anymore. Any full-scale war between them now carried the terrifying risk of nuclear annihilation, which meant the entire world now had a stake in their very fragile peace.
Which brings us to today. When you look back at this whole history, this relentless story of division, bloodshed, and mistrust, you realize that the original fracture from 1947 never healed. It wasn't a clean break. It was a shattering, and it left behind a landscape of wounds that are still raw today.
And that's the thing, right? This isn't just history from a textbook. It's a living reality.
The trauma from that separation has been passed down through generations. That cycle of war just keeps repeating, broken up only by these incredibly tense periods of quiet. Kashmir remains the explosive, unresolved core of the whole thing, and almost every single political and military decision made on both sides today is still seen through the lens of 77 years of pain and suspicion.
So it all comes down to this one final, lingering question. After decades of war, after both sides got nuclear weapons, and with nationalism on both sides stronger than it's ever been, is there really a path to peace? Or was the wound that was inflicted back in 1947 so deep, so traumatic, that this fracture is and always will be